All right, this is section 22, video 22, and we're done with civil liberties and we're taking up civil rights. Okay, what we're going to be talking about are no longer our rights as individuals. That's civil liberties. We're going to be talking about us as members of a group. And each of us is a member of various groups. Our gender defines us. So we're male, we're female. Our age defines us. Okay? Are we a veteran? That defines us. Do we smoke? Are we disabled? Are we left-handed or right-handed? Okay? There's a whole host of things that define who we are. Okay? So, our race, black, white, Hispanic, Asian. Okay? All of those define us. So, automatically, and just look at your own life, you're automatically a member of a bunch of different groups. I am a white male who is almost a senior citizen, but not quite. I am not a veteran. Okay, those define me. Now, are there rights that I have or don't have because of those categories? And those categories, those groups, are really what the whole thing with civil rights is. Let me give you a definition. Civil rights, which is also called equal rights, is the right of every person to equal protection under the law. Okay? That's the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The right of every person to equal protection of the law and equal access to society's opportunities and public facilities. Not private, but public facilities. So it is the right of every person to equal protection under the law, 14th Amendment, that's what it says, and equal access to society's opportunities and public facilities. So in other words, you can't be discriminated against when you're applying for certain jobs. Okay? Now, we'll get into some of the details about this, but as a basic rule, you can't be discriminated against when you're applying for certain jobs. Okay? So, what we're talking about here under civil rights is us as members of groups. Okay, with that in mind, I want to introduce you to 3 tests. Okay? So, we're talking about civil rights. And remember, we've used before the word tests, and when we use that word, it's a way for the Supreme Court to handle cases. Okay, so I'll move that over there. So we're talking about civil rights. And remember, it's talking about us as groups, as members of groups. And the Supreme Court said there's really 3 tests to use. One of them is called strict scrutiny, SCRUTINY, strict scrutiny. And strict scrutiny is basically where if someone's going to discriminate against someone on the basis of race or ethnic origin or on the basis of religion, the Supreme Court says they better have a very good reason to do so. They're going to look at it with the strictest scrutiny. And basically, the Supreme Court's attitude is you can never discriminate on these categories. You can't do it. Little exception here. Private facilities, you think about McMurray University, you think about other religiously based schools, universities, and they say, oh, we only want to hire Christians, for example. McMurray, that's what we say in our state. We only hire Christians. Turns out we hire a lot of people who aren't Christian too. And that's okay. That's what we decided. That's okay. But can we discriminate on that? Yes, we can if we choose to. Other universities in Abilene, ACU, Hardin-Simmons, they also discriminate on the basis of religion. Okay? They only hire members of certain religious groups. Okay? Is that allowed? Yes. Supreme Court looks at that with the strictest scrutiny and says because you are a faith-based institution, you can discriminate on the basis of religion, but you cannot discriminate on the basis of race or ethnic origin. Okay, so that's strict scrutiny. Basically, you can't discriminate with only the exception a little bit of religion. Number two is called intermediate. And if you're going to discriminate here, the Supreme Court's going to look at it very seriously. And basically, what the Supreme Court's talking about here is gender. Is it ever okay to discriminate on the basis of gender? Well, turns out the United States does it all the time in terms of the draft. All of the men in this class have to register for the draft when they turn 18. None of the women have to register for the draft. That is blatant discrimination. Okay, it is constitutional. Okay, constitutional under the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court says. Now, what people are talking about is the possibility of an Equal Rights Amendment or taking this category and moving it up here, getting rid of this altogether, and then gender is another reason you cannot discriminate. Okay, but right now, we still discriminate. Keep this in mind. If you registered for the draft or you didn't register for the draft, it was only on the basis of your gender. That is blatant discrimination. Okay, and number three, there's something called reasonable basis. And in this, let's hold this up, reasonable basis. And in this, the Supreme Court says, look, there's sometimes it's very reasonable to discriminate. Let me put it bluntly. Do we want 3-year-olds with driver's licenses? No, we don't. So let's discriminate, okay? Yeah, you got to be 16 to get a driver's license, basically. That's a reasonable discrimination, okay? To get Social Security, you have to be at least 62, okay? That's a reasonable discrimination. And the court said reasonable discrimination is fine, even under civil rights. So, the lesson when we talk about civil rights, talking number one about groups, okay? It's not talking about us as individuals, it's talking about us as members of groups. Number two, Supreme Court says that depending on the type of groups we're talking about, sometimes discrimination is reasonable and sometimes it's not. If you're a veteran, the Supreme Court allows you to get favoritism for government jobs. And the Supreme Court says that is reasonable. It's a reasonable basis. Okay? But the Supreme Court also says it is never reasonable to discriminate on the basis of race or ethnic origin. That should have no part in any of this. Okay? And then there's the question about gender. Currently, we as a country allow for discrimination on the basis of gender when it comes to protecting this country. Only men are required to register for the draft. Women are not. That's discrimination. And that's in that intermediate category. Most other discriminations against women are not allowed. But by the very fact that that is allowed, that's a huge signal saying, okay, sometimes discrimination against women is okay. So there you go. Remember, talking about groups, sometimes discrimination is allowed and reasonable. Think about those 3-year-olds driving cars. And sometimes denying someone a job on the basis of their race, it is never allowed. That is unreasonable, unconstitutional. All right.